Hi everyone. My name is Christina Quarles. I'm an artist and I live and work in Los Angeles, California, and this is my studio. So I wanted to show you all a little bit of stenciling today. So I use stencils all the time in my work, and I use everything from these complicated, crazy stencils like what made this tree bark, to things that are sort of more straightforward, like this is just a plain rectangle that's made out of blue tape. So I use all sorts of stenciling techniques in my work, and it's something that I find as another way of adding a drawn line to my work, but then also having different ways of filling in that drawn line with paint that's not always confined to the brush. So I'm going to show you a few kind of simple stencil techniques, but you can get really complicated with them if you want. And some of how you can do that is by making more and more intricate designs. So if you feel comfortable, you can start to use things like an x-acto knife, and that helps you have more of a free hand with drawing, but it's a very sharp tool. So I would recommend being sure that you've practiced using an x-acto knife before. Otherwise, you can just use a plain old pair of scissors. That works really well too. And you can even tear edges or just play with the stickiness of tape, which I'm going to show you how to do basically two different stencils today. So one is going to be with tape, and the other is going to be with just plain old magazine paper. So it doesn't matter what's on the cover of the magazine, but I find that this paper works really well because it's actually a little bit waterproof. So the same thing that makes it slick to the touch also makes it a great stencil. But I would encourage you to experiment with basically anything. I mean, I've just been experimenting with some different things for this workshop, and it's already gotten me thinking about different ways that I can work with my paintings. But basically, basically the principles of making a stencil is that you are working with positive and negative space, and you want to be sure that paint only stays in the negative space. So this is a little stencil that I made just out of magazine paper. And so everything that I cut away, so this little flower shape, that is what's going to be filled in with paint. So when you're experimenting with different materials, different papers, different paints, the two big takeaways should be make sure that you are concentrating on what you're cutting out as being the positive space, the space that's going to be filled in with color, and make sure that you're really aware of the edge. So as soon as paint gets underneath the edge, suddenly it's no longer going to quite be that crisp line that you've imagined when you're imagining your stencil. And so I'm going to show you a few things that can kind of help you keep that edge super crisp. And there's certain materials that are more forgiving. So this magazine paper, it'll move around a lot. So I'm also here. So yeah, it'll move around a lot. So you have to be sure that you keep it in place. And but when you're using something like tape, because it's sticky, it'll stay in place. So I'll show you, we can be a little bit more kind of crazy when it comes to the tape designs. So what I have out here for my supplies are magazine, tape. This is blue painter's tape, which you can get at the hardware store or art stores or online. But the idea behind it is that it's less sticky, so it's meant to be removed. So if you use just regular tape, it might take away some of the paper. So I recommend getting this blue tape. The other things I have here, I have just some paper plates. I think these are left over from the holidays, so they're red. Any color paper plate will do. And I find that they're nice for working with paints because you can have all your paints in little piles and they don't get messy. And yeah, it's just a cheap, easy way to have paint. So I have my paper plates, and then you're gonna wanna get some sponges. And you can use any type of sponge, a kitchen sponge, sponge you put in the bathroom. Just make sure that whatever sponge you use, you're going to only use for painting, because once you get paint on it, it's no good for anything else. But I like to get these little makeup sponges just because they're easy to find. You can find them at any drugstore, grocery store. So I have some of these makeup sponges. I also like them because they're small, so they're really easy to handle. And then I have some water, which I just keep in, sometimes I buy these fancier water receptacles. Other times I just take from my home my old yogurt containers. And then I have a variety of different paints. So I've been using some tempera paint for this project. So this is probably the paint that you've seen in your elementary school. It's very affordable paint, but why I love it for this project is that it's also very transparent. So when I'm talking about transparencies, basically this is an example of paint that's very opaque, which means you can't see through it. But this, the way that you can see both the colors here, that's an example of something that gets to be more transparent. And if it's totally see-through, then that's translucent. So what's fun about stenciling is that you can do a lot of layers and you can create a third image that comes from putting two images on top of each other. So that interaction of color and transparency is really exciting. And it's something that actually these kind of cheap paints are really excellent for. I also got some pencils, colored pencils, a Sharpie, regular pencil, and that's it. So to get started, I went ahead before filming today. I just made these stencils. So the way that I did this is I just grabbed a sheet of magazine paper. And then if you've ever made like snowflakes over the holidays, you can you're playing with sort of symmetry. So I would fold this and then I would cut out with a scissor this little star flower design. And then I just kind of did that over and over again. So the folds don't really matter, but you want to be sure that it can start to lie flat again, because again, we're trying to not get paint underneath. So, and I'm the type of artist, I like to do things very freestyle. So I'm going to just kind of, I don't really have too much of a plan of what this will look like. So we're just going to experiment. So let's see. So what you want to be sure to do is hold down the edges so that it lies flat. Because once you put paint down, that's kind of it. You want to just dab the paint. And we're just kind of lightly tapping, because the idea is that you don't want to get any paint underneath the edges. So that's why a sponge is a really great tool, because you're just dabbing and then beautifully you have flowers. So what is fantastic about the material of the magazine paper is that it's a lot more, well, it's theoretically a lot more waterproof, which means that you can use it over and over again. But because this is a super delicate design, you can see it's already kind of starting to come up a little bit. So I'm going to let this dry. And when I let it dry, I'm going to move over into the second stencil that I made. And I'm just going to get some yellow. And I'm just going to dab and dab. And this one, I'm just going to use a second time. So the idea is I'm kind of trying to make like a field of flowers, I guess you could say. So as this one started to dry, the edges kind of came back, which is great. Because again, it's all about the edges and making sure that you have a crisp edge so that you get this exact sort of shape that you had planned out initially. And again, this one's my troublemaker, so I'll put it aside. Go back to this one. And so I'm just kind of in my head thinking about where I want this image to go. And I'm thinking, see, this is what happens when the edges get kind of loose, but I think it's okay. I think that some of the fun thing about making art is that you're not a computer, so it can just be kind of more experimental. And maybe that's an area where I'll add another design later on. I like to kind of make decisions as I go along. And so that allows for me to not have any mistakes, because everything I do is an opportunity to come up with something new. So I think I'm going to do maybe 2 more of these. And you want to be sure to not have too much paint on your sponge because that will start to bleed through. And so from here, I think I'm gonna do a few pink flowers, just for a little bit of variety. So I'm just gonna do these, and these ones maybe will overlap a little bit. So the fun thing about the sponge too is that it's an opportunity for texture. So I think I'm just gonna kind of lightly dab these, and that's gonna give them this sort of almost spray paint effect. I'm gonna do a few here, a few here, a few here, and here. So, here's my flowers, and now I think I'm gonna return to this area in a little bit, but I wanna let it dry. So while I do that, I'm gonna do this sort of crazy sky. So what I'm using here is just this blue tape, which again is this, it's very low adhesive. And so with my work, I always like to have these sort of planes that go into the work. These sort of geometric planes. So that's what I think I'm gonna do here. So what I'm doing is I'm creating this geometric sort of shape, this parallelogram, just out of tape. So I just put down 2 parallel lines, makes a box. And again, since what I'm creating with a stencil is an outline for the negative space, what I'm gonna be able to fill in here is gonna be all color and craziness. So, because this is tape, remember I was saying that tape can be, you can be a little bit more aggressive with it. You can be a little bit more playful with your techniques. So I'm gonna take this big brush, dip it in some water, and then, actually, yeah. So I'm gonna take some of this blue, this fluorescent blue, and I'm gonna kind of fan the brush. And then I'm gonna just make this sort of wiggle. And so I always like just responding to what the materials do. So the way it kind of gets drier, I find that kind of interesting. And then I learn each time. So now I'm gonna add a little bit more water. And I'm just gonna lightly, just by wiggling the brush, it sort of will add this texture, which I think is fun. A little bit more, add some water, dab off the extra so I can really get the texture of the brush. And then I'm just gonna wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. There's an infomercial about these wiggle sponges. That's what this is reminding me of. So I'm just gonna let it dry. The thing with doing layers is you wanna make sure each one dries. I'm super impatient, so sometimes I'll just put like a fan over it, which could be good, but just make sure you're aware that all these things will blow away if you use a fan. So I'm just gonna let that dry, and then wash my brush. And then I'm going to, with a rag, which is already stuck on, I've used this a lot, but I'm just gonna wipe it down a little bit. And I think I'm gonna use a little bit of this pink, fluorescent pink. And I'm just gonna, this is still a little wet. I would recommend making this a little bit more dry, but I'm gonna be crazy. So I'm just gonna kinda, just want like a little bit of pink, I think, in here. So what I'm doing actually is I'm creating a layer that I'm then gonna make a secondary mask over. So this is gonna be a night sky. So I'm gonna take my tape again. And this time, I'm just gonna tear some little pieces. So I'm just making like just some little teeny tiny little scraps. I'm just gonna put them down. This will be not quite stars. They're kind of more, it's gonna be like more like a confetti night. Like a party at night. So I'm just gonna lay these down. Stick them down. It's just kind of, I think it's just fun to have it be sort of random, but that's because I'm impatient. So if you are the type of artist that likes to plan things out, then you can do sketches beforehand. You could have this be all very exactly cut from the tape. You could use scissors on the tape and make perfect little circles, perfect little stars. But me, I don't really have much patience. So I like to just sort of tear it and stick it wherever seems right. And it's also fun with a pattern to sort of go over the edge. And the reason is because that gives the illusion that it continues off. Because what's fun about a pattern, you can see that about using stencils, is that I painted over the edge of the tape. And that's because once we remove the tape, it's gonna have a nice clean edge. So you can be kind of messy. And again, this is all because this is tape. So we can have a lot more experimentation that can happen with the edge. Because we don't have to worry about it coming up as we do with the magazine. But the problem with the tape is we're sort of confined to just a few different techniques. So we kind of have to use the straight edge, or we can kind of cut it, but it's a little bit more complicated too. I'll show you an example of what it would be like to cut this tape, and you'll see. It's okay, but it's not ideal. I'll cut out a moon. I'll try to cut out a moon. So I'm gonna start by cutting a rectangle. The problem is that tape is super sticky, obviously, but then that makes it kind of trickier to cut around it. Gotta kind of maneuver it a bit. But I'm gonna cut out like a nice little crescent moon. And I'm just gonna put that right there. So that's all in place. This is where my thick paint's gonna come in. So I'm using this thicker paint. And with these down, you wanna make sure that you've pressed all the edges. And then this is just gonna cover that. So something you wanna think about when you're doing 2 layers of stencils is you wanna think about contrast, because if something is close in color, so if I were to paint this a light blue, all these little star shapes would not be super visible, which is okay. I think sometimes it's really fun to have something that's low contrast. It's just something to be aware of. So, mixing in a little bit of purple, and I'm gonna do kind of like a gradient. So I'm just gonna mix this gradient directly on here. Now, a gradient is anytime you have 2 colors that mix together. So you get this sort of middle tone, this gray tone. And these are something I've been doing a long time. So I must say, they can be kind of tricky. So don't be discouraged if you don't quite get it the first time. Just keep practicing. I'm still practicing. But the idea is that you're moving from light to dark or dark to light. But you're not going back, so I'm not going back to that first part. I'm getting darker and darker, and at this point I'm gonna actually change brushes. One second. I like to use these stiff brushes. And I'm just gonna do one that's just purely the dark color. So it's always kind of blending back in. It's starting with your pure color and then blending underneath. So I'll let that dry. The other thing about stencils, like with tape, is that you want to kind of let it dry a little bit, because if you try to move it around when it's wet, forget it. So I'm going to do the tape again, and this time I'm going to show you a completely different way that you can play with a tape edge. And I'm just going to do another simple design, very simple. Just another one of these parallelograms. Which I hope is the right word. It's been a while since I've taken geometry. But I think that's what these are called, because they're made up of parallel lines. I think that's how it works. So this one I'm gonna do, let's see. I'm gonna try doing a squiggle mark. So again, what we have here is the taped edge, which is a lot more forgiving. So I'm gonna take these colored pencils, and I'm actually just gonna, make sure that the edge is down. And I'm just making these sort of squiggles. And again, by going over the edge, you wanna make sure it's down because it will kind of keep coming back up. But by going over the edge, it'll give this sort of illusion of something that's exceeding this. So now this, my pencil gets really dull really fast. So that's why I have a lot of similar colored greens right here. This one kind of changed colors. So this one's just sort of like, I don't know, I always like playing around with this combination of super messy and super clean. So this is just kind of a crazy pattern, but because of the stencils, it allows for a crazy pattern to feel more organized. So let's see, just gonna squiggle. And this, I'm noticing, is a bit trickier with these edges because the pencil wants to dig through. So you're just gonna have to, you kind of have to be a little extra careful when you're going over the edge. And then just for fun, some light green. Light green, I'm gonna do big circles. Just to give it some texture. And so because this is colored pencil, we don't have to wait for it to dry. So I'm gonna lift this up immediately. But the thing to know, see I'm already creating a mess, is that you wanna lift up the tape really carefully. So you're gonna start with your last piece. And you wanna go slowly because even though it's low stick, it still sticks a little bit. So you go slowly. And see, there's the edge there. And because this is a squiggle pattern, the edge will happen anytime that the pencil has gone over the tape. So this is gonna be sort of like my crazy landscape. So you see, this is because the flowers weren't totally dry. There's gonna be a little bit of this paint residue. But because they were pretty dry, it's nothing to worry about. So, it's already starting to look like a Christina Quarles painting. So, this is still drying a little bit, so I'm just gonna show you how to do a, let's see, we're gonna cut directly from the magazine so you guys can just see. So what's also fun about the magazine is that you can look for images that you like. Just remember that it's only gonna be the outline. So it's not gonna be any of the details you see inside because it's just a stencil. So I could just trace this, but I don't think I'm going to, so I'm gonna use this side because I can see better. I'm gonna use marker, and I'm gonna draw, See, you can also kind of draw here so you can understand the scale. So I'm gonna draw a leg with a big foot, calf, and then it's gonna cut off at the thigh. Because with my pieces, I always have people that are kind of going in and out of planes. So this time it's just gonna be a big leg. And because I want it to be the negative space, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna choose an area where I have a lot of room to play with, fold it in half, and then I'm just gonna cut a little hole, and that gives me a way for my scissors to go in. So, then I just trace my lines. And I'm just cutting along the line. Now here, I put my design very close to the edge, which is okay, but you have to be careful because it's going to be a lot more fragile and you might end up painting over the edge, which again, I don't think that mistakes really happen that much in art. I think everything is something that can be potentially really interesting. But if you have a vision, sometimes it can be frustrating when you make a mistake. So if you want to try to avoid that, I suggest making a design where you have plenty of room on the edge. You also I recommend doing a design that's fairly simple, because a lot of interesting things can happen just from the layering and the textures of the paint. But if you're cutting out a really complicated design, it's just something to be aware of. It can be very frustrating. You can make a wrong move and then suddenly you cut it. But the nice thing about a magazine is that you have well over 100 pages to play with. And you maybe even get one for free, because people don't like to keep magazines around. So I think I'm going to put this foot right here. So see this piece of tape? I need to move that. So put this here. So again, now that this is the magazine one, there's a lot more opportunity for paint to get underneath. But what color? I think I'm just gonna go for black. Now this would be a time where you have to make a decision. Do you want it to be transparent or do you want it to be opaque? If it's transparent, you're gonna see the design. So that's why I'm gonna go with black. So I want it to be more opaque, but there's lots of colors that can be opaque. It's not always black. So it's very easy for this to go under the edge. So I'm gonna hold it down and then I'm just gonna put the paint on here and dab off the excess. And then do that. Again, I kind of love this like sponge texture. So I'm gonna kind of play with that and maybe not even make it fully solid. And you kind of don't want to go over it too much because then it starts to curl. So that's when I'm going to lift this up. And there's my foot. So I think I have about enough dry. I would let this dry a little bit more if I wasn't having all of you here. But I just want to, I'm excited, so I want to show this to you. So I'm slowly releasing it, falling off the tape, putting it in my discard pile, and then slowly releasing, because I don't want to get any of the paper coming up. I want to do them one at a time, kind of in the opposite order. And so I'm doing these planes because that's just something I love doing in my art, but there's so many different designs you can do, even with just the straight line of tape. And if you're a little bit older and a little bit more skilled with an x-acto knife, there's ways you can play with that in the tape. So this requires a tool. I'm just going to use a pencil. Actually, I'm going to use tweezers. One second. Assistant Elliot got me some. So I'm just gonna use some tweezers to pick off these pieces. You can use your fingernails, but it's because it's a little bit wet, I'm not going to. So see, all these places where I put that little bit of confetti and did that underlayer, that's when it's really fun to use stencils. I love this part. And I still use blue tape all the time in my paintings. And I cut directly on the canvas, which is very nerve-wracking to watch. because you have to be very careful to not cut through. And the way that I discovered that was just by trying it out. You know, I think you gotta just experiment as an artist, and you gotta experiment with your own tools. And a lot of the things I use are just because I don't have anything else around, or maybe I can't afford art supplies that week. I can only afford to get whatever I can find at the grocery store when I'm buying my groceries. And so maybe they're having sponges on sale, and I buy a bunch of sponges and see what I can do with them. I sometimes, in the painting behind me, I used an actual comb for your hair to make the texture of the hair on there. So you really don't need to use just art supplies when making art. And in fact, I think some of the best art happens when you use things that aren't art supplies, because then it looks really unique. So I've got just a few more of these. These tweezers are very handy. I actually do recommend, if you're picking up some sponges in the beauty department, pick up some tweezers too. So there's my little night sky. And so it's all the paint that I put on first, and then it's the next stencil that's over that. So this is what I have so far. Yeah, it's, you know, it's a work in progress. I'm gonna still work on it. But it gives you an idea of sort of all the different techniques you can use with stencils. And yeah, and hopefully you can have a lot of fun and play around with it. And I mean, you don't even have to just use stencils with making a piece like this. You can get at this point and say, you know what, actually, maybe I want to do something freehand. Maybe I want to take, maybe it's like, maybe I've done enough of that. Maybe now I want to do another leg that's done with like just a brush, you know. And so it doesn't have to be all stencils either. Stencils, I think, are something that's just another tool, and so you can use a lot of different tools when making a work of art. And I certainly love using a lot of different things when I'm painting, and it doesn't have to just be one thing. So maybe you want to do some drawing on a piece of paper and then add some stencils. See here, I'm like painting around one of the little flowers because I want it to be on this leg that I'm just going to freestyle. So it's really, there are no rules. There's just certain techniques. And so this is a technique where you can use a straight edge in order to make messy textures that still have a sense of feeling like they're clean, crisp lines. So see, painted leg next to a stencil leg, do whatever you want. So that's it for now, but have fun, and I hope you make some really great art and come up with some techniques that maybe I haven't thought of and share them with other people. So take care and bye.